Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I am so excited for my guest today is Mark Nelson. Mark, can you tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I guess my greatest claim to fame and infamy is I was part of the Biosphere 2 crew for the first closure experiment 1991 to 93. I'm also heavily involved in ecological engineering, kind of putting into practice what we know about ecology in challenging projects around the world. And I was a co-founder, and I'm the head of the Institute of Ecotechnics. And I am now in beautiful semi-isolation in Santa Fe, or outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Oh, nice. I haven't. I think I passed through Santa Fe once. I haven't got to spend any time there, but hopefully I'll get a visit in with you when all of this clears.
Totally.
You also have a new book out, correct?
I do. Very good timing, because I think by the time this podcast is released, we're shooting for a second edition of Life Under Glass, which is a really gripping first-hand account that I and two of the other crew members, we call ourselves Biosphereans, and we can get into that later. We published the first edition actually and wrote it while we were inside Biosphere 2. And now we've updated it with, a look back on the importance of Biosphere 2, a great second preface by Sylvia Earle, the marvelous ocean explorer, and research highlights, etc. But we've left the core of the book as is because of its historical value. So that's going to get released on Earth Day, just coming up in a week and a half or so. So it's Life Under Glass, Crucial Lessons in Planetary Stewardship.
So why don't you tell the listeners and viewers how the Biosphere Project came together in the first place, and then how in the heck you found yourself living in a biosphere?
Well, the two stories are kind of connected, and I guess the very short version is, after working with a group of people in the Institute of Ecotechnics and having conferences on really big topics and meeting some of the top ecologists, scientists, explorers, and thinkers of our time, we thought that we're big space nuts. I think that part of the future of humanity is in space. Mm-hmm. And so we met a lot of people from the space program, and it was really clear that we could do really amazing things in terms of rocketry and astronautics, but life support and the ability to sustain people in space, especially on a long-term basis, was really lacking. So one of the inspirations of Biosphere 2 was, let's see if we could make a man-made, a human-designed biospheric system and learn what we don't know about biospheres. So eventually we could build similar systems on the moon, Mars, in orbit. And of course, we designed it also to be a beautiful Earth laboratory. So we pulled in a really large design team, many institutions from the University of Arizona, Smithsonian, the New York Botanical Garden. You could go on and on and on. And we launched it with a couple of conferences exploring, was this totally crazy or is this doable, in 1984. And, having gotten enough either remarkably crazy people as well as being world-class scientists to say this is doable, and it should be really, really interesting to learn from. We spent the next 3 years in deep design work for Biosphere 2, and we had to build basically a whole research complex. The project was located in, appropriately enough, Oracle, Arizona, which is about an hour north of Tucson and an hour and a half down from Phoenix. So we built this research center, including a small closed system, and then we broke ground for Biosphere 2 in 1987. And it was a massive, if people should definitely go and look up images of Biosphere 2, because we decided to make it a stunningly beautiful architectural facility as well as this pioneering research one. So it's quite glorious. And 300 to 400 people were often working on and inside of Biosphere 2 for 3.5 years to get it ready. And finally it was, and there's another story about, originally I was a director of the project, and the more I learned about closed systems, and I had an experience, a quite life-changing experience in our Biosphere 2 test module, I decided to join the trainees and become a candidate for the closure. And luckily enough for me, I was chosen as part of the first team of 8 and spent 2 years in there.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on if you were to build Biosphere 3 today, some 30 years later, would it be, how much easier would it be? Would there be any like new modern technologies or anything that
oh, totally.
would be used? Yeah.
we used to joke, because it was state of the art for 89, 90 when we finally had to make decisions. But we spent $20 million with Hewlett-Packard to design a extremely complex 1,000 sensors and control panels to where data was available on a fairly instantaneous basis. And I'm pretty sure you could buy that off the shelf and it would be a much better system than we had. We used to joke that eventually, because we built Biosphere 2, and people often forget that, to be a 100-year experiment. And it's gone through some changes in how it's being operated. But we always figured that all the technology that we originally used would go into a biospheric museum of ancient but once impressive technology.
I imagine. And then how long did you end up living in the biosphere for?
Well, the design of the first mission, the first experiment, was 2 years. And one of my teammates calculated that we stayed in there 2 years and 20 minutes because some of the celebratory speeches went on a little bit. So it's a little bit ironic. A number of our heroes were there at the, we call this the re-entry. It was the re-entry to Earth's biosphere. And by the way, I'm sure some of your listeners are thinking, why Biosphere 2? Where is Biosphere 1? Well, it's not a secret Pentagon project deep in the Rocky Mountains. Biosphere 1 is our planetary biosphere. And currently it is the only biosphere and planetary biosphere that we know, which I think should underline, why it's incredibly precious. It's also our life support system. And people are beginning to realize that.
How closely were you trying to model Biosphere 2 after Earth, after Biosphere 1, and what were the major differences?
Well, I mean, when people say it's a model of planet Earth, that's insane. That's it gives people an idea, because it was a stunning facility, and it's hard to remember now. And you're obviously a younger generation, Shane, and many of your listeners. But in the mid 80s to early 90s, people didn't even know what the word biosphere was.
I think it was a Pauly Shore movie that informed most people.
Biodome, pretty embarrassing. Yeah. I think I went in incognito to see it. I was finishing my PhD in Gainesville at the University of Florida. Yeah, so I mean, we've learned a tremendous amount, back to your question. But and the hope was, in fact, that there would be a Biosphere 3, 4, 5. The fat lady hasn't sung. Our point being that we spend enormous amounts on cyclotrons for physicists. When you think about the stakes of learning to live in a regenerative, a sustainable way with our global biosphere, that price tag that gets bandied around, the $200 million for Biosphere 2, we would cut that a lot, and you could make biospheres in a lot of different versions. And probably the price keeps on coming down because we had to do a lot of pioneering research. So back to your question about, was it a model of planet Earth? No, of course it wasn't. We didn't have deep geology. We didn't have mountains. we had a rainforest mountain, but it was like 30 feet tall to simulate a cloud forest in the Amazon. And Biosphere 2, it was like a slice of the tropical world. And we decided, of course, in Oracle, Arizona, we have plenty of sunshine. It gets really, really hot in southern Arizona. Tourists don't come there in the summertime for good reason. So we had a series of land-based and water-based biomes, like little versions of rainforest, tropical savanna, a fog desert, a coastal desert. We had an amazing system. I'm in love with every part of the living system there. But we managed to replicate 5 ecological zones of the Florida Everglades in about 200 feet. We had a coral reef in a living ocean. Still to this day, it was the largest coral reef ever designed. And then, of course, we had 8 people and we had to feed ourselves. So we had a half-acre farm that was amongst the most productive in the world. And it had to be highly productive, and we couldn't use any chemicals because in a tightly sealed system with virtually no air exchanging between inside and outside, if we use chemicals, our watchword was, if we put a chemical into Biosphere 2, it's going to be in our food and in our tea within weeks. So a mindfulness such as we all need to start emulating certainly permeated the crew. We don't do anything bad because we will suffer. The biosphere's health and our health are the same. So Biosphere 2 is certainly not a model of planet Earth, but it had large enough, recreated chunks and diverse biodiversity that it could be a really new kind of Earth laboratory. And so lots and lots of research came out of the work that we were doing.
How much was there incentive to model the way Earth actually is, as opposed to just making simply the most livable system for humans, and going like, well, do we really need deserts that bad, or what compromises were made to make it livable?
Well, many compromises were made, and I do remember Sylvia Earle, who spoke at the re-entry, as well as writing the foreword to the second edition. She was like, if you really were trying to model planet Earth, the ocean should be 70%. And there were other people saying, why have a fog desert? It's not that productive. But we love that the savanna and the desert, we call them our biovalves because they had an active season. And then once you cut off the rain, they kind of go into hibernation. So we could play with their cycles. The other reason I was smiling is that the most serious group that was going to make Biosphere 3 was this group of Russian Soviet scientists. And they said, in Biosphere 2, we tried to make it as clean and healthy as possible, which I have to say I appreciate. What they said, we're going to make one in Russia, and Russia, the Soviet Union, is really, really polluted. So we'll make Biosphere 3, maybe in Moscow or maybe on a Russian mountain, and we'll make it really polluted. We'll have, pollution in the water, in the air, in the soils, and we'll use the Biosphere 3 as a way of studying how to clean up a biosphere. And to me, that kind of illustrated why I still think we should think about making more biospheres. I think every first-class university should make one. Every first-class city should make one, both for research and for public education. And you could do it, if you put one up in Scandinavia, I don't think you're going to make a tropical rainforest. You could have a whole suite of the northern biomes there.
I mean, why don't they just make it partially a reality show and get funding from doing that? Everyone tunes in to watch like Survivor or Big Brother or all
Shane, I hate to confess, but full disclosure, the first guy who did the Big Brother was a Dutchman who came to Biosphere 2, and he saw the excitement. Now, I have to say, when we were thinking and building Biosphere 2, we had no idea that it would capture the world's imagination. We
Mm-hmm.
thought that it would be a quiet research facility. Why would you put it in southern Arizona if you wanted people to come to it? But we figured it was privately funded by Ed Bass primarily and some corporate sponsors, that we'd make back the investment by spin-off technologies and selling one maybe to Euro Disney and to Los Angeles and Tokyo or London, New York, places where millions upon millions of people go, and they would
Mm-hmm.
go to a spectacular real Disneyland, not a fake Disneyland. So, but
Mm-hmm.
Biosphere 2 caught the world's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back on it, I'm it's not that we were such geniuses. I think there was sort of a hunger at that time that Biosphere 2 tapped into. It's really hard, as I say, even the word biosphere was kind of foreign territory. But Biosphere 2 was small enough. It was only about 3 acres of land space, very tall ceilings, but what's that mean, 80, 90 feet? But it was small enough that people could actually visualize what a biosphere is.
Mm-hmm.
And then we became, our zoo exhibit. We're the living biospherians. Now that was
Mm-hmm.
kind of shocking. And occasionally we'd pick up our cameras, because there were 50 or 100 people outside pointing cameras at us. But I finally got to really enjoy it because we were demonstrating that being ecological, being a biospherian is not a deprivation. That's what,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was tough. There were tough aspects, and we'll talk about that, group
Sure.
dynamics. But it was 2 of the greatest, most spectacular years I've ever spent.
Hmm. So, we mentioned technology. Obviously, there's been leaps and bounds, and especially in computers and sensors and everything else in the 30 years since. What do you think about culturally the differences between where people were then on environmental issues and where people are now, especially now that there's a pandemic and everyone's talking about an apocalypse and all these I think the idea of a biosphere would seem pretty appealing to people these days.
Well, I do like this. I mean, obviously, the pandemic is going to be very tragic. It's shocking, and we don't really know how it's going to play out in this country, or especially in poorer countries, less well equipped to deal with it. But we
Mm-hmm.
used to say that Biosphere 2 is 50 years ahead of its time, and it's just remarkable, especially the younger generation, how much they're on board, and you don't have to start by explaining a lot of things that took a lot of words and dramatization, for older people to get. You know, the pandemic is something I think once we get past that, we need to really focus on the relationship between humans, technology, and the biosphere. And I'm not a Luddite. I love my laptop. My girlfriend did beat me into getting an iPhone, etc. But humans are technologically very gifted. We're like kids with new toys. And when you think about the span of Earth history and even human history, the Industrial Revolution was only 300 years ago. We are still learning the consequences of technology. This was
Mm-hmm.
another thing that I loved about Biosphere 2, because we had to get not only great ecologists to achieve, this amazingly diverse world inside a glass house, but we had to get engineers who could carry out the ecologist's vision, and the engineers had to learn, because Biosphere 2 is virtually airtight, that no machine, no materials, no process could go into Biosphere 2 that would produce contamination, pollution that the living systems couldn't recycle and integrate. And that, I think, is that's the edge. We'll continue to make amazing
Mm-hmm.
technological advances, but we are just beginning to realize that technology lives in the Earth is far more tightly sealed than Biosphere 2.
Mm-hmm.
Every machine that we put out there has consequences, and we need
Mm-hmm.
to think about the totality. And that's starting to happen. It's amazing. Global climate change, you know, It used to be a point of pride in the 19th century, cities to have dirty air and big, tall smokestacks. Now, because that was a sign that we're modern, we're making money.
Yeah.
We need to figure out how to make human life, really well, accomplish everything humans need to do, but without this unintended consequence of damaging our health and the health of every other living being.
Hmm. I mean, just in terms of the world of science, I mean, I've only been kind of into science communication stuff for 8 years or something, and chatting with scientists for under a decade. But it seems like interdisciplinary is this big buzzword these days that maybe people weren't talking about the importance of being interdisciplinary as much in the 80s, and I wonder if universities would be more receptive to more experiments like this. And as you talked about engineers needing to learn ecology, and it seems like scientists that I've talked to are starting to kind of understand that, and you hear a lot of criticism about reductionism and how we need to understand these emergent properties and these dynamic systems and these butterfly effects and stuff like that. So do you think that people are in some regards more receptive to some of these ideas?
I'm doggedly optimistic. But I have to say, I'm in my 70s now. Multidisciplinary work has been a buzzword ever since I went through university in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And it mostly gets talked about and not implemented.
Yeah.
Hey, we are flexible. Humans are survivors. And I think it may focus our minds that we're actually, in a very serious way, talking about the sixth extinction. Oh yeah, meteors have hit the planet and, catastrophic geologic events. This is the first time we're driving really large number of species to extinction because of human action.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a terrible word that, since I'm into eco-psychology, it's called solastalgia. And it was coined by an Australian environmental psychologist. It is the sadness that people feel when a beloved landscape or city starts to degrade and become less pleasant and habitable. And I think that's a near universal condition around the world. But is this inevitable? No, this is not inevitable. Like we could have put in, slums and deprived areas and had a junkie corner like I grew up with in New York City and Biosphere too. But these are all, any problem that humans have made, humans can fix.
Yeah.
This is wonderful.
Yeah. Well, that was going to actually be my next question in terms of replicating Biosphere 1 and Biosphere 2. Did you throw any idiots in there just to like screw up policy or anything for you guys that you would have to work against?
We didn't quite do the biodome of having two complete morons in there. But what I like, and I think Life Under Glass sort of illustrates, is that we were pretty a diverse group, and we decided, maybe a little bit ahead of our time. There were 4 women and 4 men in that crew that I was part of. That was a given. We were going to be gender neutral, and patriarchy, I think, is one of the problems of our time. When we're really looking at the deep-seated issues and how the world needs to change and is going to change. Yeah. So, but none of us were ready to actually operate a world. And the challenges that happened, I think I got a little taste of it. I'd mentioned already that 24 hours I spent in that test module absolutely blew my mind, because, I've devoted my life to ecology and to trying to, meet human needs while upgrading the surrounding ecology. But I realized how much of that was in my head and not in my body when I was in that test module for 24 hours. You get in a closed system, and the intensity and the interdependency of you and all of that life form becomes absolutely, you know, breathtaking.
Mm-hmm.
It's visceral. I don't really, I have a chapter, I wrote another book before this second edition of Life Under Glass called Pushing Our Limits. And I had 2 chapters on the human experience, one dealing with cabin fever and intergroup tensions and, you know, what would happen if you went to an extended family Thanksgiving and no one left for 2 years, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But the other part of it was that it was remarkably satisfying, joyous to understand that we were vital. We were not just morons. Because it was a man-designed, human-designed biosphere, we had to keep the technology going because the technology was supplementing a lot of what our Earth does for free and so reliably. We weren't parasites or cancers. We were a necessary part, but all that technology, and this drove the engineers absolutely out of their minds at first, all that technology was not going to keep Biosphere 2 healthy, nor our big species diversity alive. Life was going to do that, but we had to provide the right circumstances for life. And one of the big jobs that the Biosphereans had is we wanted to have a beautiful, diverse biosphere. If some vines started taking over, as the morning glories did in our rainforests, threatening species extinctions, we would move in. I call us team biodiversity. And I think that is happening, you know, restoration ecology. You know, a lot of what we incipiently were doing in Biosphere 2 is being played out on a large scale and needs to be made even bigger. We were the number one thing that we thought we couldn't stay in there for 2 years is we thought we couldn't control carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide levels would really go up. That was in our minds like every day. You know, we could look at sensors that were changing every 15 seconds. Cloudy weather in the winter meant that our CO2 would rise. So we had to get involved. You know, atmospheric management was a hands-on job for the biospherians and in our consciousness. Now, Kyoto had just happened, but, you know, all of that climate change, which rightfully so, when we get over the pandemic, we need to get back to really addressing climate change and making changes that I think will be win-wins. If we get rid of air pollution, that's not only helping climate, it's helping human life. If we make our food cleaner, if we make our water cleaner, it's like, you know, being ecological is not a penalty. It is the quality of the life that we live on planet Earth.
I mean, I'm so, I wouldn't say that I'm doggedly optimistic myself, nor have I ever been. I think I'm a hair cynical. I think if I have I am finding that during a pandemic, everyone's becoming caricatures of themselves. The optimists are the most optimistic. The pessimists are the most pessimistic. The conspiracy theorists are the most conspiratorial. The left is the most left, right, and just everyone's just like cartoon versions of themselves. So I'm realizing, like, oh yeah, I'm a very cynical, skeptical person, and that I've been working on that about myself, but now it's coming to the surface.
Well, you know, I love. Our sound.
Oh well, I was just going to say that I am definitely optimistic that people can become more aware of climate change than ever, but I'm pessimistic that policymakers are going to use this as an opportunity to strip every environmental regulation that exists in the name of feeding our God, the free hand of the invisible hand of the free market, you know, as a sacrifice to the economy, and so I'm definitely concerned about that.
Well, being an optimistic does not mean that you disregard facts and probabilities, but, you know, we need to take the longer picture. And you know, well, first off, I can't stand, you know, and a lot of people who are called environmentalists are, and maybe rightly so, raising gloom and doom.
Yeah.
That's not a winning formula. I mean,
Right.
I think we much more need to say to people, and we have an instinct in virtually all of us. I don't, unless you're really, really damaged. E.O. Wilson called it biophilia. I grew up in New York. I grew up in Queens with a lot of amazing parks. Take a Manhattanite and put him in Central Park. Put almost any human being in a natural setting, and there, we just fire off all these great hormones and pleasure gets triggered. So I think that, and a friend of mine formulated this, optimism is a yoga. It's a discipline. And we can't afford, I mean, it's just too self-indulgent to become, pessimistic and despairing, even worse. Because what it will do is psychologically, one, make your day much lousier, and it will probably nullify your belief that you can make a difference. And, again, going back to that particular experience, Biosphere 2 was like, when I first met the Russians, who are the leaders in closed systems, we have a project in Australia. I sent them all boomerangs from Perth, because it really struck me that in a closed system, the consequences of actions come back really rapidly, like a boomerang. Instant karma, you might say, if you're New Age.
Yeah.
There are no anonymous actions. So the really beautiful thing in Biosphere 2 was even a small action like, let's improve the irrigation somewhere here or there. Well, we have to cut some, PVC pipe and pull out some glue and solvent. That's not an anonymous action. We would actually check with our analytic laboratory and see the gases that will be released by making that technical repair. How are we doing on levels of those gases? So it's quite extraordinary when, I think that, we have smog indexes and this, that, and the other. We should be really letting people know, if you live in Chicago or Detroit or Santa Fe, what are the pollutants in your air and where are they coming from? Where are they coming from? Let's have, random, analyses of the food that we're eating, so you can appreciate, if it's a local grower only using natural sprays or it's laden with residues of pesticides. The more we become aware of what's happening, why are we putting up with it? I spent, so I came out of New York City, okay? And when I grew up, they said, and now I think it's probably true, that even if you didn't smoke, breathing New York City air was like 2 packs of secondhand cigarette smoke a day. I spent 20 years of my life on and off up in the Kimberley region of West Australia. Think Crocodile Dundee, which is kind of my movie, because I was a New Yorker and there I was running a project in the outback. But once you really experience how clear a sky can be, how beautiful well water can be, how there's not a trace of pollution, and then you experience going to London or New York or pretty much any industrial city in the world, and you feel your lungs begin to take shallower breaths. Why do we put up with it? We don't have to.
So many questions. One, here, this is so absolutely fascinating. One, you trying to take despair away from me now. That's just like, that's the only thing I'm holding on to. Despair is my oldest friend. That's an important message about, I've had moments in my life where I've had to be mindful of learning helplessness, and continuing to move forward and look for solutions in my life. But I also, in terms of scale, what are some of the comparisons? It's almost like in Biosphere 2 compared to Biosphere 1, it doesn't, I think what's hard to get through to people in Biosphere 1 is the impact one individual can make. Whereas when you're in Biosphere 2, how many people were in Biosphere 2?
8.
Eight people.
Yep.
And you guys were the only mammals, I take it, right?
No, we had domestic animals. We had
Oh,
pigs and chickens and goats. I guess chickens aren't mammals.
oh, okay.
We had little galagos in the wilderness areas. They're like a small type of African monkey,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we entertained them and they entertained us.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
we were certainly the largest mammals.
Well, I guess the point I was thinking of is a lot of this, everyone can do their part to lower their individual carbon footprint, and then you do that and you put all the work into recycling and using gray water systems in your house, and you do all that, and then you look at the government giving a bunch of your tax money away to oil companies for subsidies, and like you said, you see these factories cranking out smoke. I imagine there wasn't factories in Biosphere 2. Was there like manufacturing of any kind in there?
Well, we actually had a really great crew member. His nickname was Laser. He was another Mark, Belgian Flemish guy. So he could actually fabricate spare parts, and we did a lot of improvisation of system and improving systems in there. But a full-on factory, I wouldn't call it. But
Mm-hmm.
no, technology is part of it. And by the way, the Russian leaders in the field early on gave us the opposite. I dealt a lot with NASA and some of the other space agencies, and NASA's always like, oh, we love our engineering, we love our machines, let's try to figure out how to put the absolute minimum of life out into space. So they started out trying to, as the Russians did also, just have one algae, regenerate the air and water and be the food. And more than 1 ounce of that algae and people get quite sick. Anyway, with the Russians moved on to higher plants, and eventually NASA did too. But they said, look, the lesson that we learned in closed system is that life is reliable, because everything living has gone through millions, if not billions of years of evolution and fine tuning. You can count on technology breaking down. The only question is when, not if. So, so technologically, you have to have a lot of redundancy if you want to keep systems going technologically. But life, that's a wonderful viewpoint. And we think about it, so, in Biosphere 1, we are the recipients of this amazing living system. I'm kind of a fan of Gaia because it just made people think. No, I don't think that it's one living super organism, but it's pretty astounding. And I think that, for me, yeah, I mean, look at your carbon imprint, become politically aware and active, be a citizen, at every level that you can, your community, your neighborhood. Right now, fortunately, I'm 20 miles out of Santa Fe, and it's planting time. We're planting gardens and getting our orchard. So there's about 14 people that we are really careful about, anyone going to town and anyone from town coming out. We're kind of self-aggregating. But, you may have to give up your despair if you want to live a better life. Don't give up your sense of humor and irony. I love a great black comedy. And I think you have to look at the human predicament with a fair bit of humor.
Oh yeah, I've been cracking more jokes than I have in like my entire career during all of this, and humor's always been a coping mechanism and survival mechanism for me, and I don't shy away from a dark joke. But at the end of the day, I kid, and I do think that I don't talk a lot about the environment on the show. We talk a lot about neuroscience, behavior, human psychology, and the idea of learned helplessness, and the science that I've learned behind it is, I think, one of the most troubling things to me about the human condition, and I think people should do everything that they can. So I wanted to ask, was there insects in Biosphere too?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I imagine. How many different species did you
Many,
have?
many, and we also had a number of volunteers, stowaways. We had some birds that we just couldn't trap out. Some English sparrows and a
Huh.
beautiful rock thrasher, and unfortunately, there was they call them a tramp species, kind of a pervasive tropical ant that's found in greenhouses around the world. And
Hmm.
it's a little bit erratic in its behavior. So we had a problem with those ants, and they managed to wipe out a lot of our pollinators. But Biosphere 2 was a pretty daring, I like to call it a kick-ass experiment. We were leaping way beyond what was known. I mean, it's pretty amazing that we managed to stay in there for 2 years, and a second crew was in there for 7 months and they actually grew 100% of their food. We grew about 82% of our food. Still pretty amazing, a complete balanced diet. But there were surprises. There were unexpected things. And
I imagine. I mean, it's so interesting that the idea of these butterfly effects is something most people are familiar with now, but this is the incredible undertaking that science has to do to examine these butterfly effects on Earth. The idea of something having a ripple effect that goes across the world and teasing apart the many variables and everything. But for you guys, there must have been times when, like, oh, we're going to plant some peas here, and then next thing you know, you're overrun by ladybugs or something. And
oh yeah, totally.
There must have been a lot of stuff like that happening.
I can remember, in fact, we were replanting the top of our cloud forest because we couldn't keep it cool enough. So we were switching ecology and planting sugarcane and whatnot. And I put a trowel into the soil, and my God, about 25 scorpions, like, out of some Hollywood horror movie, emerge from the soil and start moving towards me. So little moments of horror.
Wow.
But what I loved about Biosphere 2 is, if people remember some of the events, we started having this mysterious loss of oxygen. And it got serious enough that, we fell to 14% oxygen. That's like 7% less than normal, sea level oxygen on planet Earth, that we finally had to inject oxygen. And we did that in a measured way. Yes, we wish we didn't have to do it, but we didn't want to imperil the health of ourselves and other creatures in there. Mm-hmm. But when we went into we had these lungs, these variable volume chambers, and it had like 25% oxygen. And suddenly we were laughing and running around. It was under a geodesic dome covering to protect it from the elements. And I realized I hadn't heard any running feet for months and months and months. Because another thing that happened is that we were following, our resident doctor was a pioneer on the low calorie but nutritionally dense diet, low cal diet. And he loved it because we were the first group of people who couldn't cheat and were studied intensively on that. We were like madly trying to increase the amount of calories. So we started victory gardens all around the biosphere, trying to put a plant to catch the sunfall. The amount of sunlight entering Biosphere 2 is our limiting factor. So I'm a bit of an insomniac, and I would be planting and moving trees to better positions, in the wee hours of the night. And, we grew about 2 tons more food the second year in. We were still, for the amount of physical labor we were doing, farming and doing all the research and maintenance of the facility. But that 2,000 extra, 4,000 extra pounds were quite marvelous. So we regained a little bit of our weight the second year.
What did you or most people kind of miss the most while you were in there? Were you guys making your own booze or anything in there? Yeah, you were.
Yeah, we were. Yeah, our best product was a banana wine. That was,
Oh.
I don't know whether, it would be, a supermarket or traded show would carry it, but we were growing rice, and we have a lot of Tibetan friends. We did a project with Tibetan refugees in Kathmandu, so we all knew about Tibetan chung. It's kind of a rice beer. So we made some chung, and red beets were one of our spectacularly successful crops, such that we really got sick of it, and you
Yeah.
couldn't figure out what to do with it. So a Belgian researcher with the European Space Agency gave us a recipe for red beet whiskey, and that was so bad. That was so bad. I mean, it's hard to even tell you, but we were so starved for alcohol that it got consumed anyway.
Yeah,
You
sure.
Shane, I wanted to go. You asked how did I get involved, and there's
Yeah.
an aspect of this which I definitely want to share, and
Absolutely.
and it will also be a way for me to segue into talking about this movie Spaceship Earth.
Yeah.
That's going to be released soon. So I came to New Mexico. I was 22 years old. I just graduated from Dartmouth. I'm from an immigrant Jewish family. They wanted me to become a medical doctor or something with a respectable profession behind it. I wanted to, do something different. So through a series of good fortunes, I met this group, I met someone who was headed out to New Mexico where they had just bought some land to begin ecological work. And when I came there, I was told that the program was we do three things. We work on ecology, we start enterprises, and we make our projects self-supporting, and we do theater. So you were bringing up multidisciplinary things. And when I heard that, and I didn't really know, what the theater meant, etc. I didn't know what any of it meant. I thought enterprise was getting a job, and I'd been a taxi driver. I was going to do that maybe in Santa Fe. But when I heard that program, it suddenly struck me that what was really making me discontent was the idea that I had to pick one thing that I was going to become, rather than living a balanced life. Because I think all of us have an artistic, emotional side. Enterprise made sense to me because then you're doing your innovative work, but you're actually interfacing with the people around you. And if what you're doing is good and validated, you can survive economically. And ecologically, you're working on the bottom line, that you can maintain, that you've got viable economics, but the top line, that you're actually improving the environment. So our test case was, and this is where I'm now, my main base is, and I spent my first decade with the Institute here, 𝕊𝕐𝕐𝕗 Ranch, 135 acres of really crap land that's actually been ecologically messed up in about every which way you can think. They took out the trees to plow up the prairie to put crops in. They overgrazed, it was kind of a scene of ecological devastation that I, as an Easterner, had never seen. So what, I was put in charge of trees and gardens. We planted 2,000 trees, including 500 fruit trees in an orchard. We started building our own buildings because we had, at that time, it was like the base camp, the Marine boot camp for ecotechnics. So, in those early years, we'd have 20 people in the winter and 35 people in summer. So we started building adobe houses and a geodesic dome, which got us to meet Bucky Fuller. So this film, Spaceship Earth, is pretty interesting because it takes the trajectory, and very fortunately, both because we're doing theater and making films, etc., we had tremendous documentation. So when these people, got intrigued by seeing the images of Biosphere 2, and they came out when they looked at our archive room, and they realized the amount of documentation of all sorts that dated back from the beginnings of the group in Haight-Ashbury in 1967. That's when the theater arm of our sort of overall enterprise began, the theater of all possibilities. How's that for a good no bounds kind of title. So we had a theater that we did classic plays and new plays, new age plays. One of our visionaries members who invented Biosphere 2 is a playwright. So we did everything from Shakespeare and Brecht and Moliere to, you know, pretty cutting edge plays at all of our projects. So out in the outback of Australia where I was, we would make outback comedies sort of lampooning our own lives and the lives of this crocodile Dundee with lots of Aboriginals instead of Native American culture. And we put it on in Aboriginal communities as part of the town festival, and you really get integrated in. And, you know, here's a bunch of Yanks, and Aussies don't like Yanks a whole lot, you know, but they could see that we could take the piss. That's Australia from, you know, poking fun at yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we could take a joke and we can make a joke, you know.
Right.
So I think that three elements, so that, you know, one of the beautiful things, you know, Spaceship Earth is an amazing, I hope people find it inspirational. They brought a few of us up to Sundance. So it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, and thank God that happened in late January, and it wasn't scheduled for March or April.
Right.
So it got sold to Neon. They're the distributor, and, you know, stay tuned for how Neon figures to distribute it. But I think they're getting excited that, like you're saying, in this pandemic, this is kind of a pause time, that maybe the story of Biosphere 2 told in a much, you know, deeper way, and that trajectory of people who are trying to do, you know, kind of make a different world and make a difference, even with small numbers. So the film is quite interesting.
So, as an optimist, seeing this is a chance for change. This is a chance for raising awareness, for implementing new policies, new individual behaviors. I mean, one of the big things that happens a lot of times in crisis is people get really into self-help stuff, and they start exercising more and taking better care of themselves. And there are real opportunities for individual and collective progress and growth. What are some of the lens through which you see the Earth, the Biosphere 1? If you could, what are some of the least costly and easiest to implement changes that would have the biggest benefit as you see it?
All right. Well, I'm going to go all metaphysical on you. And I think in the, you know, the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, you start with putting the right ideas into your brain. There's a phrase maybe from the Middle East, metanoia, change of thinking. So I think, you know, before you get on your bicycle and, you know, decide to, you know, cut down on soft drinks and many other things that may be useful to you personally and the planet, I think it starts with you really grokking, there's a good 60s word, with you really trying to understand what your life is based on. You know, and I was thinking when you're talking about this, you know, my isolation includes going out into orchards, but I'm just picturing, you know, if you're in Chicago or Detroit, when you come out and you go to the nearest green park and, you know, breathe in the oxygen under those trees, you know, it'll be a little bit special because you've been inside, maybe only watching nature documentaries. And there's a phrase, you know, he was kind of a hero of mine. So, you know, I'm going to pass this on. But he said something about, we're not going to save the Earth, you know, the biosphere, unless we fall in love with it. Because you don't fight for something unless you're in love with it. So I think, you know, it's partly really grokking, really coming to an understanding that wherever you are on planet Earth, if you are a mammal like us and you have lungs, you are breathing air that has been, you know, enriched with oxygen because of all the plants in the ocean and all the trees and everything, all the grass, even the crabgrass you may not like in your lawn. They're all working big time to produce that. Think about your food. You know, after Biosphere 2, I was in charge of the sewage system. So I became a shit recycler with constructed wetlands. And at the end of another book I wrote called The Wastewater Gardener, I came up with, hold your britches, the fecal meditation. The meditation when you get on the loo and, you know, you're going to, you know, hit the lever. Your beautiful nutrition hopefully is going to go someplace where plants and microbes can digest it and put it back in circulation. But you know what I loved about those constructed wetlands is they connected people with thinking about where's the water when you turn the water on in, you know, your tap, where's that coming from? The more you can learn about that, and you know, water is on a vast, you know, remember from high school, you know, high school boring science classes, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, you know, so the more you know, get curious about what keeps you alive, and you will keep on running into the power of what we used to call Mother Nature. Yeah. Love your mother nature. So I think, you know, the really profound change happens in, you know, trying to internalize that and just let that percolate, keep working on it. You know, I wish in a way that I was in Biosphere 2, because after that oxygen thing, we sort of said to ourselves, we're never going to take a breath of air in a negligent and thoughtless way. Now, of course, you know, we're human beings and habits come in. But I, you know, that experience is not that far away from me. And people have, you know, you don't have to go into a biosphere. You know, you people who take care of Central Park, you know, they're out there every, you know, in a million ways, and you can fall in love with microbes. You know, the microbiome. Look at all of that we're learning about. In fact, I learned, you know, COVID-19 alerted to me. I know nothing about viruses. You know, so a few bad germs give microbes a bad name. Google, you know, viruses. You know, it's like that thing about the number of organisms in a pinch of soil. If you take a little spoonful of water, there are gazillions of viruses. There are gazillions of viruses everywhere. They're more numerous than the microbes. And in Biosphere 2, you know, we paid reverence to the microbes. They were our safety factor. We call them the unsung heroes of the biosphere. So yeah, COVID-19's given viruses a bad name right now, but they're part of the biosphere. We're all biosphere. Now back to we chose Biospherean rather than econaut or bionaut, with the idea being that, oh, those people inside that system are Biospherians. Well, what in God's name are we out here? We're Biospherians of Biosphere 1. The microbes are Biospherians of Biosphere 1. The redwoods. The technology. Before I left Biosphere 2, I hugged a lot of concrete pillars and stroke machines because they also were on that journey with us. They were part of our biosphere. So technology is not, it's not, you know, money is not the root of all evil. It's the love of money. Technology is not going to be, it's not going to be a techno fix, but you know, technology is part of the modern world. And I think, you know, some astute observers thought Biosphere 2 is really interesting because the interplay, the interconnection between technology and life was so profound in there, but it is in our modern world.
So this has been an amazing conversation. Let's make sure and plug all of your stuff one more time. Where can people check out your book? Where can people check out Spaceship Earth?
Well, Spaceship Earth, you know, they could Google, or, you know, because I think there's going to be news coming. What is it? It's April 8th. You know, by mid-April, I think Neon is going to be announcing how it's going to get distributed. So that's Spaceship Earth. The second edition of Life Under Glass, you can go to Synergetic Press, the publisher both of the original Life Under Glass, the second edition, and they're also the publisher of my Wastewater Gardener. And I didn't tell you the subtitle, Preserving the Planet One Flush at a Time. So,
oh, amazing.
dark humor. I always tell people it is the funniest book you're going to read about shit recycling. And the other book that I want to plug is Pushing Our Limits. That was published, Insights from Biosphere 2. That was published by the University of Arizona Press. You can go to the University of Arizona Press, or any of these books are available through your usual internet suspects.
Without opening, as maybe I'll have you on again sometime to talk about one of your other books. But I did just happen to mention gray water in passing as an example, not realizing that you had that book. Is that something that is? I haven't looked into it myself. I've never owned my own home, but is that something that's fairly easy for the average person to implement?
No, and it's also not a panacea. It's not the universal. Yeah. I love constructed wetlands. They're really difficult if you're in an urban environment, because the trade-off is you need area to make these constructed wetlands. Certainly, being conscious of your water use is a good thing. But I think the book will interest people, even if they're not going to go out and build a wastewater garden in their backyard, or, tell the super of their apartment building, I'm going to make a few changes in here. And I also, cover composting toilets and gray water irrigation. But it's also one of those paradigms. I think I quote somebody who said, if you really study the modern sewage systems of planet Earth, you have to ask, is there intelligent life on planet Earth? Because we waste all of these nutrients, and we treat the products of our body like they are some deadly chemical. And I don't mean light, you need to be responsible about it, but we are literally flushing away incredible amounts of clean water. Part of the insanity is using clean drinking quality water to flush away our bodily wastes. And those bodily wastes used to be called night soil, even in Europe and certainly in Asia, because they are, the stuff that life thrives on. So it's it's a beautiful book, and it's hilarious because I was going to call it Holy Shit, but my publisher said we're not going to be able to sell it to libraries, and you can't even use that term, that four-letter word, on NPR when you're talking about you're not cussing, you're actually talking about the subject. So it's another one of those places that we need to make a paradigm shift, and a paradigm shift is coming because, as people have pointed out, if everyone on planet Earth had a Western flush toilet, we don't have enough water to flush them. So as part of my optimism, the political climate is pretty rough right now, not just in this country, but in a lot of countries. But long term, if you're on nature's side, if you're on the side of your health, human health, and the biosphere, time is on our side. These changes are being resisted. There's big money and power, that the people who profit off business as usual. But, their days and years are numbered.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on my show. This is absolutely terrific. I can't wait for people to check out all of your things. Do you have just a general website that people can go to check out all of it in one place?
There's a few. There's Ecotechnics, ecotechnics.edu, synergeticpress.com. I have a pretty underwhelming personal website called Mark Nelson Biospherean. So if you put in Mark Nelson and Biosphere 2, it might be page 2 or 3. You'll find that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
And I just realized, Shane, that you are the I in the I.
Yeah, this is my podcast logo. It makes for a nice little virtual background. So
beautiful.
Thanks for joining me, and thank you listeners for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you next episode.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.